This might just be the most advanced medicine on the planet. Despite being only a few thousand atoms long, it acts as if it was aware of the world around it, changing its shape to adapt to the needs of the body in real time. This is the most sophisticated mastery of biology and chemistry that I have ever seen, but I am slightly biased. I played a very small role in helping to create it. This is the output of 3,500 years of humanity trying to combat just one of the diseases that harass our bodies, and how we learn to produce something so sophisticated, in some ways it starts to rival the very complexity of biology itself. This can very much be thought of as a cure for diabetes.
I think I could pull through, sir.
But in telling humanity's story about how we learned to build this capability, I want to also tell a deeper story. This breakthrough is part of a larger movement in medicine, the dawn of what I think of as Medicine 4.0. Not quite godlike in its capabilities, but uncomfortably close. Let's dive in. The story of diabetes stretches back millennia. In ancient Egypt around 1550 BCE, diabetes first entered the medical lexicon. In the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts, it described a disease characterized by too great emptying of urine. They really had a way with words. These early physicians didn't know what caused it, but they observed its devastating effects: unquenchable thirst, dramatic weight loss, and eventual death. Our medicine version 1.0 phase very much can be summarized as a wizard told me to do it. Our approach was characterized by treating illness as much as a spiritual problem as a physical one, and treatments included herbal remedies like bitter gourd, the oil of roses, broken red coral, sweet almonds, which at least sounds kind of palatable, combined with spiritual practices such as chanting, mantras, and meditation to balance the mind and body. These approaches generally were unsuccessful, but even as early as Egyptian times, Medicine 2.0 developed, and it showed a different approach. Doctors embraced empirical study and record keeping and turned to much more natural remedies rather than spiritual ones. Around 400 BCE, across the Indian subcontinent, enough cases have been seen that diabetes could be recognized by another unmistakable sign: the sweetness of urine, which is a phrase I don't say that often. Physicians noticed that ants would swarm around the urine of afflicted individuals, drawn to the unusually high levels of sugar within. They called it honey urine disease, and noted two distinct forms: an aggressive type often seen in children, fatal within weeks or months, and a less severe form affecting heavy, wealthy people, which is humorous if not an unfortunate demographic description, but shows evidence of systematically trying to understand who this disease affects. They had correctly stumbled upon what we now classify as type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and their treatment approaches also started to make a little bit more sense. Seeing it related to larger individuals, they prescribed exercise and specific diets. Diets were rich in things like wheat and grains, bones and fish, or maybe slightly less pleasantly, grit, green lead, and earth. They were doing so well. Others prescribed nothing but raw meat or even chalk, hoping to slow the body's apparent self-destruction. The good news, some of these treatments did actually have some level of effect, and diet and lifestyle changes still recommended for all types of diabetics. But for many, it wasn't enough. But here is a good point to remember that access to good food, even in our increasingly modern and busy lives, is an important topic, and it's being made possible thanks to today's sponsor, Factor. Factor lets you skip the meal prep while getting fresh, never frozen, restaurant quality pre-prepared meals that are chef crafted and dietitian approved. There's a weekly menu of 35 options, including popular options like Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, or Vegan and Veggie, all ready in just 2 minutes. I recently have loved the time that Factor has saved me while preventing me from reaching for fast food or junk food. You can change at any point your order up to every week, with plans from 4 to 18 meals per week, and the ability to pause or reschedule deliveries anytime. It is super convenient. If you want to join me enjoying restaurant quality meals from home, head to factor75.com or click the link down below to use code 50 Dr. Ben Miles and get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50 Dr. Ben Miles at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Thank you again to Factor for sponsoring this channel. Now, back to the video. Beyond diet and exercise, Medicine 2.0 started to feature compounds with genuine therapeutic properties. In the 18th and 19th centuries, milk of the poppy, more commonly understood to be an early version of today's morphine, became a popular treatment for diabetics. The problem with Medicine 2.0 is that these natural therapeutic remedies had an effect, but often not the exact one that you were looking for. Morphine didn't cure diabetes, but it did dull the symptoms and perhaps perhaps the anguish of these patients dealing with their range of enforced diets. Our entry, though, into Medicine 3.0 came when we started to command specific targeted therapies, finding the specific key in the human body and unlocking it to cure or treat disease. For diabetes, this came alongside a breakthrough in the late 19th century by German scientists Joseph von Mehring and Oskar Minkowski, who discovered that removing the pancreas from dogs caused them to develop diabetes, and sparking a race to uncover the specific substance in the pancreas responsible for controlling glucose levels. This was finally solved in 1921 when, in a small laboratory in Toronto, Canada, Frederick Banting and Charles Best successfully extracted insulin from the pancreas of a cow and injected it into diabetic dogs, leading to an almost immediate and full reversal for the first time in history of the symptoms of diabetes. The following year, in January of 1922, they administered the first human treatment to a 14-year-old boy named Leonard Thompson. As they administered it over the course of just a few minutes, Thompson awoke from a lethargy back to full and vibrant consciousness. It must have felt like a miracle. While not a perfect cure, insulin gave patients their first real lifeline, allowing them to manage their condition and live longer and healthier lives. This ability to bind or block to particular receptors defined this era and included everything from penicillin, which blocks bacterial cell wall synthesis to treat infections, to things like CAR T therapies, where we teach the body's natural defenses to bind to and destroy cancer cells. And while this might seem like a wildly diverse set of tools, they're all kind of playing the same game. They block, bind, duck, dip, dive, and dodge their targets in pretty much the same way, to varying levels of complexity. And although that is very powerful, some things are just more complicated than these tools alone can solve. The creation of artificial insulin is just a simple binder to insulin receptors in the body, and it isn't without its flaws. Patients still have to meticulously monitor their blood sugar levels and inject insulin multiple times each day. Inject too little insulin and glucose levels sit too high. Above 7 millimolar when fasted is a state known as hyperglycemia, and starts doing damage to our eyes, our nervous systems, and at more extreme ends induces ketoacidosis and potentially death, which generally people hate. Inject too much insulin and glucose levels crash. Below 4 millimolar, the body becomes hypoglycemic, at the mild end resulting in dizziness and maybe grumpiness, and at the extreme end induces coma and potentially death. Our bodies do this monitoring and management to within just 3 millimolar incredibly effectively when they are working, but when you have to inject insulin yourself, you are essentially operating your body on hard mode. Even if you use monitors and pumps, these systems can all still fail. This leads us to a point where you can't just help but think, nature did it better. What if you could create a medicine that didn't rely on engineering solutions or manual dosing, but instead was self-aware, capable of detecting how much glucose is present in blood and understanding when it should be operating, and changing its form and function to meet your body's needs? What I am talking about is nanomachines, son. Or at least something that looks quite a lot like it. But how do we actually build them?
Special Agent Brixobenzomethamphetamine.
There is one significant problem with glucose. To a chemist, it looks a lot like fructose, or sucrose, or many other sugars. To an optical physicist like me, it looks kind of embarrassingly like water because of all the hydrogen bonds. It even kind of looks like paracetamol. That's a problem if we want to make a medicine that can respond to glucose levels in the blood supply. We don't want it accidentally triggering if someone has a headache. That's going to lead to a bad time and probably a lawsuit. It was with this challenge that our story starts at the chemistry department at the University of Bristol, the university I did my PhD at, in a group led by Professor Tony Davis, developing a class of chemistry called synthetic lectins. These are artificially designed proteins that mimic nature's ability to recognize and bind to specific carbohydrate structures, like glucose. The challenge in designing these molecules is to build something that binds to glucose and only glucose, not fructose or paracetamol, and that it binds tightly and quickly, but at some point it releases. Otherwise, it's essentially removing glucose from the blood supply. This is an unbelievably difficult chemical challenge, but after many years of research, some very primitive candidates were produced with approximately the right properties, leading to this Nature paper. And now I think it's worth noting here, after big breakthroughs like this, advancements often kind of go quiet, much to the internet commenters' annoyance. It's a video in itself, but in an overly short summary. This is because academic funding supports the development of breakthroughs, not then advancing those breakthroughs to the point when they are useful. Equally, you might say, well, this is surely where industry should step in. Maybe, but it rarely happens because these ideas are still very early, need a lot of work, and may still fail. We are lucky in that in Tony's lab was Harry, a PhD student who in 2015 thought to launch a startup to fill the gap of moving this breakthrough forward so it didn't end up just as a really cool PDF. Things went really well for Harry until a year later when he hired me as technical employee number 4 or 5 straight out of my PhD as head of engineering, which is reasonably easy when there's only 2 people in the engineering team. He tried to give me the title of lead engineer, but I proudly said, sorry, I'm a physicist. So my title became lead physicist, and immediately that backfired when people read my title on email and thought I was a lead physicist, as in studies lead. So there you go, there's some level of karmic justice for all the engineers out there. We had a pretty hard journey as a startup. We realized there wasn't any wet lab space in Bristol for startups, so we ended up building our own building. Our engineering team was incredibly distractible and ended up building an electric skateboard controlled by a laptop. My theory here was that if we got it working, you could commute and do work at the same time. It ended reasonably badly. Luckily, the chemistry team was some of the best in the world and turned the chemistry from only possible if the stars aligned to something about 1,000,000 times better than anything produced by mankind or nature before, a system that bound and released glucose and only glucose. But there's an obvious question here that we've been skirting around, which is, that's not a medicine. How do you actually make it useful? To answer that question, we need to look at the current medicines that are being used, the hormone insulin that diabetics inject to regulate their sugar levels. If you look at insulin, you notice that it has a long, thick region in the middle, and then these 2 long, spindly arms that sort of float and flow, like a gentle version of those inflatable guys outside of gas stations. If these arms of insulin are free, insulin is a great molecule and binds easily to insulin receptors in the body via a binding site somewhere on the thicker part of the molecule. The body then kicks into action, storing glucose into muscles and fat and slowing down the liver's production of additional glucose to reduce the blood sugar levels in the body. However, if you connect the 2 arms together, they link in such a way that they block access to insulin receptors' binding site, and insulin can no longer dock, essentially switching it off. The breakthrough idea was to attach the glucose binding molecule to one arm of insulin, and to bind something similar to glucose that wasn't glucose to the other one. For this, we picked a glucoside, basically glucose plus a couple of additional atoms. This would, in theory, then do something amazing. When there is sugar in the blood supply, the glucose binding molecule will catch and release the glucose happily over and over again, and insulin will be free to function as expected. However, if sugar levels fall and there isn't anything for the glucose binding molecule to catch, even though the glucoside isn't a perfect fit, the fact that it is so close means that it will start to have weak binding interactions. These will pin the arms of glucose together, covering insulin's binding site and turning it off. Should the glucose levels rise again, glucose would start to outcompete the glucoside binding and insulin would snap open, reactivating. It was at this point with this exciting idea around 2018 when the team started to realize doing all of this alone was going to be really hard. They were very fortunate at this point to team up with Novo Nordisk, one of the largest suppliers of insulin in the world, and conversations got kind of interesting, and ultimately Novo decided to purchase the company and continue the collaboration. By this point, I kind of felt like I had made the contribution that I could to this endeavor and had slightly phased myself out of the process and took a very small windfall from the event, remember, just an employee, to start helping out other scientists to turn their theory into action, and started building companies with academic teams around the world. The majority of the chemistry team, though, stayed collaborating with Novo, and a couple of months ago, after 6 years of further work, they got there. Publishing again in Nature, they produced a modified insulin molecule that is able to self-regulate. Now here they decided to give it the somewhat catchy name of NNC-2215, not to be confused with NCC-2215, which obviously is the Starship carrier USS Gentian. Pretty sure that was intentional. The very complicated bit that you may have spotted I entirely glanced over was getting this insulin to work in a human at physiological conditions. It needed to deactivate below a precise 4 millimolar of glucose to keep the sugar levels where we actually want them in the human body. Tuning that system system is what took 6 years. To study how NNC interacts with the insulin receptor, they compared the receptor affinity for NNC to its affinity for human insulin and a current clinically used form of long-acting basal insulin. You can see here each system gives broadly similar responses when tested in the presence of 20 millimolar glucose. However, when the glucose concentrations are decreased is when interesting things start to happen. At 10 millimolar, human insulin and the basal insulin perfectly recreate the same binding behavior as at 20 millimolar. But for the NNC insulin, there is a reduction in binding strength. This trend continues at 5, 3, and 0 millimolar glucose in solution. The binding is 12.5 times weaker when glucose levels are at 0 millimolar compared to at 20 millimolar. Exactly as theorized, the team have produced the world's first insulin capable of understanding the world around it. To see how this medicine behaved in the body, the research team also ran some animal studies. In diabetic animals, they supplied them with a constant intravenous dose of glucose to simulate a meal. They then added either normal insulin in one population or NNC in another population to simulate how a diabetic injects insulin to regulate their sugar levels. They tuned the quantities of both glucose and insulin so that the blood sugar levels were held constant. Then they stopped the glucose line, simulating the end of a meal. This caused immediately the glucose levels in both populations to plummet. For the basal insulin population, their blood glucose levels dropped to a dangerous low, similar to if a diabetic patient injects too much insulin, and hit concentrations as low as 3 millimolar, hyperglycemia, where researchers immediately stepped in to restart the glucose supply to prevent damage to the animals. For the NNC insulin, glucose levels dropped rapidly, but suddenly started to plateau. At around 4.5 millimolar, the NNC insulin had automatically deactivated itself, preventing further glucose absorption and keeping glucose levels within a healthy tolerance despite NNC insulin continuing to be administered. To put this in context, this would mean that diabetics would never again have to worry about accidentally over or underdosing insulin. They could administer confidently that if they got their numbers even slightly wrong, the insulin would deactivate itself to keep them safe. This, like I said, is the most advanced medicine I have ever seen. And yes, I am still biased. And just to emphasize, I have no financial or otherwise connection to this work or output. I just think it is ultra cool science. This rightfully has been echoed by several people as the culmination of thousands of years of humanity's work to produce the best diabetic treatment possible. I am incredibly proud of all of the team members that have worked on this for so many years to bring this together. The question might be, what happens next? We are clearly entering medicine 4.0. We have many other types of medicine coming to market at the moment, specifically things like cancer treatments that can do clever things like react to pH levels or temperature levels so that they only damage cancer cells and not the rest of the body. We also have awesome things that I've covered on the channel before, like this domesticated nanorobot that can deliver medicine right to where it is needed within the body, like a more helpful version of the Sentinel from the Matrix. This NNC insulin needs further refinement and proving out before it is fully ready for use by human beings, but my hope is that this is firmly in its future. What does that future look like though? To get us to Medicine 5.0, which is where we secretly have all been wanting to get to because everyone has been watching way too much Warhammer 40k universe recently, Medicine 5.0 probably looks like either building an organ that produces these sorts of medicines directly in the human body, awesome, or more realistically, learns to regrow, regraft, or repopulate cells back on the organs that need them. Some work has already started trying to regrow the cells on the pancreas to re-enable its own insulin production capabilities, but this work is still many years away. Here I also want to leave off on a little bit of a reality check and a more positive note. We have to talk about pricing.
Rising insulin prices
has more than tripled in a 10-year span.
Insulin, in particular, has received a lot of press for unfair price points, especially in the US. A 2020 study found that the average price per vial of insulin in the US was more than $98, compared to less than $8 in the UK. That, put very simply, is brutal. There is no other way to put it. There have been some positive changes recently, such as the Inflation Reduction Act, which caps insulin prices for Medicare recipients science at $35. I still think that more can be done here, and this is coming from someone that runs a venture capital fund. Let me say it loud and clearly, I want fair pricing for medicine. Yes, pricing dynamics differ significantly between countries, but time and time again, when you look at centralized healthcare systems, you see the benefit of having bulk negotiating power. Ozempic cost $938 per month in the US. It cost $93 in the UK. It turns out that if you help your neighbors, it ends up helping you. I'll leave that point there. What I think is really exciting is that this sort of breakthrough is becoming more and more common. And what I love is that these are not originating in large pharmaceutical giants or big corporations, but are coming straight out of university labs. We used to just think of tech bros dropping out of college and starting software companies. Now it's less tech bros dropping out and more scientists doing PhDs to produce cutting-edge insulins, quantum computers, or new energy technologies. These innovations are fundamentally reshaping entire industries, and they're starting in a place where curiosity and discovery reign supreme. I think it is a good time to be a scientist. This was a really fun story for me to tell. Obviously, it has been a huge part of my life for maybe 10 years or so now, but I only wanted to share it once I had kind of a nearly ending to the thing. Obviously, there is still a ton of work to do, but hopefully one day this technology will make its way into the hands of the people that will most benefit from it. As for me, when I'm not on YouTube, I still help scientists upskill in entrepreneurship and co-found startups with them. Currently, I'm raising my second venture capital fund so that breakthroughs like these receive the funding that they need. If you are a scientist in a university lab working on something cool and would like support to turn theory into action, I will leave some links down the description below for how to get in touch with some of my teams. If you think scientists are rock stars, consider grabbing yourself a t-shirt like this one down in the link below. I donate all the proceeds to schools and charities to help them buy science and school supplies. If you like this video, feel free to leave a like or join us as a channel member. Thank you, as always, for watching. I'll see you guys next week. Goodbye.